The girl in the burning car shouldn't have been alive. Her eyes were open, staring through the cracked windshield at the stranger who had just pulled her from death, and her lips moved to form words he couldn't hear over the roar of flames and the wail of approaching sirens. Jake Sullivan had saved her. 3 minutes of shaking hands, performing CPR on scorching asphalt while his 8-year-old daughter watched from their rusted truck. Now the girl lay on the stretcher, paramedics swarming around her, and as they lifted her toward the ambulance, she turned her head. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through everything. "You shouldn't have saved me, sir. The accident hurt, but maybe I would have gone somewhere happier." The evening sun painted the highway gold, but all Jake could see was the darkness in those 18-year-old eyes. His daughter Lily stood beside him now, small hand gripping his bloodied fingers, watching the billionaire's daughter being loaded into an ambulance. And Jake realized that saving a life and giving someone a reason to live were two completely different things. The traffic on Interstate 75 moved like a slow river that Thursday evening, brake lights flickering red against the fading daylight. Jake Sullivan gripped the steering wheel of his 1998 Ford pickup, the kind of truck that had more rust than paint, more memories than working parts. The engine rattled with every breath it took, a sound he'd grown so used to that silence would have felt strange. Beside him in the passenger seat, Lily pressed her small face against the window, watching the world blur past with eyes too knowing for an 8-year-old. "Daddy, why did you stop saving people?" Her voice cut through the engine noise like a blade through paper. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles going white. In the rearview mirror, he could see the plastic bag from the hospital pharmacy swinging from the coat hook, full of medications they could barely afford. Lily's heart condition had a name he could barely pronounce, but the price tag was crystal clear: $300,000 for the surgery she needed. And he had maybe $2,000 in his account on a good month. "Sometimes people get tired, sweetheart," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Tired wasn't the right word. Broken, maybe. Haunted, definitely. His hands trembled slightly on the wheel, the way they'd trembled for 8 years, ever since the night everything fell apart. He glanced down at them, these hands that used to save lives, that used to move with confidence through trauma and chaos. Now they shook when he tried to hold a coffee cup, when he reached for Lily in the dark, when he remembered. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of better days. Days when he wore scrubs instead of a security guard uniform, when people called him Sullivan instead of "Hey you," when his daughter had 2 parents instead of 1. His ex-wife had left 3 years ago, unable to handle the weight of medical bills and a husband who woke up screaming from nightmares. He didn't blame her. Some weights were too heavy to share. Lily coughed, a wet sound that made his chest tight. He reached over and squeezed her hand, feeling how small and fragile it was. "We'll figure it out," he said, though he had no idea how. The doctors had given them a timeline, 6 months, maybe 8 if they were lucky. After that, her little heart would simply give up, tired of fighting a battle it was designed to lose. He'd been picking up extra shifts, working security at the mall until the early hours, then sleeping a few hours before taking Lily to her appointments. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache, but physical pain was easier to handle than the other kind. Under the passenger seat, hidden beneath a stack of Lily's coloring books, sat his old emergency medical kit. He hadn't opened it in 8 years, hadn't touched it since the night he walked out of County General Hospital and never came back. Sometimes he thought about throwing it away, but something always stopped him. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was guilt. Probably both. The kit held bandages and medications that were likely expired, tourniquets and tools that once felt like extensions of his own body. Now they felt like artifacts from someone else's life, a man he used to be before everything shattered. "I love you, Daddy," Lily said suddenly, her voice soft. She said it the way kids do when they sense their parents need to hear it, when they feel the weight of adult worries pressing down on the car like invisible hands. Jake swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. "I love you too, baby girl, more than anything in this world." It was the truest thing he'd ever said. She was why he got up every morning, why he worked jobs that ground him down to dust, why he kept breathing even when breathing hurt. The highway stretched ahead of them, familiar and endless. They were 10 miles from home, from their small apartment that smelled like her medications and his instant coffee, from the life they'd built from scraps and determination. 10 miles from another night of him lying awake, calculating impossible math, trying to figure out how to save his daughter when he couldn't even save himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. 8 years ago, he'd frozen when a child needed him. Now his own child needed him. And all his action, all his desperate scrambling, still wasn't enough. Look, Daddy, that car is going really fast. Lily pointed ahead where a black Tesla was weaving between lanes, moving at a speed that made Jake's stomach drop. Even from a distance, he could see something was wrong. The car wasn't just fast. It was out of control, jerking left and right like a wounded animal. Other drivers were pulling away, creating a bubble of empty asphalt around the Tesla as it accelerated. Jake eased his foot off the gas, putting distance between his truck and whatever was about to happen. He'd seen enough accidents in his years as a paramedic to know how this story ended. Metal and glass and blood. Always blood. "Don't look, Lily," he said. But it was too late. The Tesla hit the median at 70 miles per hour, launching into the air in a way that seemed to defy physics. For a moment, it hung there, suspended against the sunset like some terrible bird, and Jake could see through the windshield to the driver inside. Young, female, her hands not even on the wheel. Then gravity remembered its job, and the car came down hard, rolling once, twice, 3 times before landing upside down in the northbound lanes. The sound of it was thunder and breaking glass and something else, something worse that Jake remembered too well. Traffic screeched to a halt. Cars swerved and honked, creating a jagged constellation of vehicles frozen in shock. Jake pulled onto the shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs. Smoke was already rising from the Tesla, black and thick, carrying the smell that made his blood run cold. Gasoline. He could see it pooling beneath the car, spreading out like a dark mirror, reflecting the dying light. Inside the crumpled vehicle, something moved. Someone was still alive in there. His hands were shaking so badly now that he had to grip his knees to steady them. 8 years ago, another car, another child, trapped and bleeding. 8 years ago, his hands had frozen, his mind had shut down, and by the time he could move again, it was too late. The boy's mother had screamed at him, words that still echoed in his nightmares. "You just stood there. You just stood there and watched my baby die." "Daddy," Lily's voice was small and scared. She was looking at him with those wide eyes, the same eyes that looked at him every morning like he was her whole world, her hero, her protector. Around them, people were getting out of their cars, but no one was moving toward the wreck. They stood at a safe distance, phones out, recording, always recording, never helping. The smoke was getting thicker now, and Jake knew what came next. Fire first, then explosion. Maybe 3 minutes, maybe 4 if they were lucky. He looked at his hands, these treacherous things that had betrayed him once and would probably betray him again. Then he looked at the emergency kit under the seat, covered in dust and doubt. Then he looked at his daughter, his reason for everything, and saw her watching him, not with fear, but with faith. She believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She thought he was brave, even though he'd spent 8 years proving he was a coward. "Stay in the truck, Lily." His voice came out steady, which surprised him. "Lock the doors. If anything happens, if I don't all come back, you call 911. Can you do that?" She nodded, tears already streaming down her face. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, wanted to promise he'd come back, but he'd learned the hard way that some promises couldn't be kept. Instead, he kissed her forehead, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo, trying to memorize this moment in case it was his last. Jake grabbed the emergency kit and stepped out of the truck. The heat hit him first, radiating from the wreck in waves that made the air shimmer. The gasoline smell was overwhelming now, mixed with burning rubber and something chemical from the car's battery. He could hear screaming, though whether it was from the wreck or from the bystanders, he couldn't tell. His feet moved toward the Tesla, even as his mind screamed at him to run the other way. 300 feet, 200, 100. The smoke was in his lungs now, making him cough, making his eyes water. The car was a ruin of twisted metal and shattered glass. The roof had caved in, the doors were crumpled, and spider webs of cracks covered every window. But through the windshield, he could see her, a girl, maybe 17 or 18, hanging upside down from her seatbelt. Her eyes were closed, blood running down her forehead in thin streams. She wasn't moving. For a horrible second, Jake thought he was too late again, that history was repeating itself in the cruelest way possible. Then her chest rose and fell, shallow but there. She was breathing. She was alive for now. His hands were shaking so badly that he almost dropped the kit. The old panic was rising in his chest, that familiar tightness that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. Not now, he begged his body. Please, not now. He forced himself to focus, to remember his training, to let muscle memory take over where his mind was failing. The driver's side door was crushed beyond opening. The passenger side was closer to the flames, but it was his only option. He pulled on the handle and it didn't budge. Pulled harder. Nothing. The metal had warped in the impact, sealing the girl inside her own coffin. A rock. He needed something heavy. His eyes scanned the ground and found a piece of concrete from the median. He grabbed it, ignoring how it cut into his palms, and brought it down on the passenger window. Once, twice, 3 times before the glass gave way, shattering into 1,000 pieces that rained down into the car. He reached through, unlocking the door from the inside, pulling it open with strength he didn't know he still had. Heat poured out, and with it, more smoke. The fire was spreading faster than he'd thought. Maybe 2 minutes left now, maybe less. He crawled through the window, cutting himself on the glass still stuck in the frame, and reached the girl. Up close, he could see she was young, so young it made his chest ache. Expensive clothes torn and bloody, jewelry that probably cost more than his truck glinting in the firelight. This was someone's daughter, someone's whole world, just like Lily was his. Her seatbelt had locked on impact, holding her suspended, but the pressure on her chest was making it harder for her to breathe. He pulled out his trauma shears from the kit, the same ones he'd used 1,000 times before, and cut through the belt. She fell into his arms, dead weight and limp. He maneuvered her through the passenger door, his shoulders screaming in protest, his lungs burning from the smoke. Behind the car, flames were licking up toward the gas tank, hungry and inevitable. The heat was intense enough now that the hair on his arms was singeing. He dragged her away from the wreck, his legs pumping, his heart exploding in his chest. 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet. Not far enough, never far enough. He laid her on the asphalt, putting his kit beside her, and started his assessment the way he'd been trained a lifetime ago. Airway, breathing, circulation. Her airway was clear, but her breathing was shallow and rapid. He checked her pulse at the neck, at the wrist, weak and thready, barely there. Then, as his fingers pressed against her wrist, her pulse stopped. Just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. No, 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 no. His hands hovered over her chest, shaking so violently now that he could barely control them. Daddy, help her! Lily's voice cut through everything, sharp and desperate. She'd gotten out of the truck, despite his orders, was standing at a distance, watching him with tears streaming down her face. All around them, people had their phones out, recording this moment, this failure that was about to happen. Witnesses to his cowardice. Round 2. The girl's lips were turning blue. Every second he wasted was a second closer to losing her. Jake's mind flashed back 8 years. A different parking lot, a different child, the same shaking hands. The boy had been 10 years old, hit by a car while riding his bike. Simple trauma. Nothing Jake hadn't handled 100 times before. But that night, something in him had broken. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His mind wouldn't work, and he'd stood there, frozen, while the boy's life slipped away. Even now, he could remember the mother's face, the way she'd looked at him when they pronounced her son dead. Not with anger, but with something worse, disappointment, like he'd personally betrayed her, personally chosen to let her child die. He'd quit the next day, walked away from 10 years of training and experience because he couldn't trust himself anymore. Couldn't trust these hands that trembled and failed when people needed them most. He thought he was doing the right thing, protecting future patients from his inadequacy. But now, looking down at this girl, he realized he'd just been protecting himself, running away from the hard thing, from the scary thing, from the possibility of failure, just like he'd been running for 8 years. Shaking hands can still save lives, son. His father's voice, clear as day in his memory. His father had been a paramedic too, had worked trauma for 30 years before a heart attack took him. Jake remembered being 12, watching his dad's hands shake as he tried to eat breakfast after a hard shift. Daddy, why do your hands shake? He'd asked. His father had smiled, tired but genuine. Because they remember what they've held, Jake, all the lives, all the weight. But they still work, they still save people. Don't ever forget that. Jake positioned his hands on the girl's chest, feeling her sternum beneath his palms. His hands were shaking, but they knew what to do. 30 compressions, hard and fast to the rhythm of staying alive. Ironically enough. 1, 2, 3, 4. He could feel her ribs flexing beneath his hands, could feel the resistance and give of her chest. 15, 16, 17. Sweat was pouring down his face now, mixing with tears he didn't remember starting to cry. 28, 29, 30. He tilted her head back, pinched her nose, and gave 2 rescue breaths, watching her chest rise and fall with the air he pushed into her lungs. Behind him, the Tesla exploded. The shock wave knocked him forward, the heat washing over his back in a wave that felt like standing too close to an open oven. Metal and glass rained down around them, and Jake threw himself over the girl's body, shielding her with his back. Something sharp hit his shoulder blade, something else his lower back, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. He went right back to compressions, counting out loud now. 1, 2, 3, 4, come on, breathe, come on. The world had narrowed to just this, just his hands on her chest, just the rhythm of CPR, just the desperate hope that this time would be different. Lily was screaming his name, the crowd was shouting, sirens were wailing in the distance, but none of it mattered. Only this girl mattered, only this moment, only the chance to do it right this time. 15, 16, 17. His hands were cramping now, his arms burning with lactic acid, but he didn't slow down. 28, 29, 30, 2 more breaths. Her lips were still blue. Come on, he thought. Fight. Choose to live. Please choose to live. Then, like a miracle, she gasped. A huge, wet, desperate gasp that pulled air into her lungs and life back into her body. Her eyes flew open, witbuoy and unfocused, the deepest brown Jake had ever seen. She stared up at him, this stranger with bloody hands and a smoke-stained face, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then she coughed, turning her head to the side, and he supported her, helping her clear her airway. She was alive, against all odds, despite his shaking hands and his 8-year-old trauma. She was alive. The paramedics arrived in a chaos of lights and motion. Jake stepped back, letting them take over, letting the professionals do their job. His legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the asphalt, his whole body shaking now, adrenaline crashing through his system like a drug. His back hurt where the debris had hit him, and when he reached around to touch it, his hand came away red. He was bleeding, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The girl was being loaded onto a stretcher, paramedics calling out vitals and starting IVs, and she was alive. That was all that mattered, and Lily crashed into him, wrapping her small arms around his neck, sobbing into his shoulder. You did it, Daddy. You saved her. You're a hero. He held her tight, feeling her heart beating against his chest, fast and strong and so precious it hurt. I'm not a hero, baby. I'm just a man with shaky hands who got lucky. But even as he said it, he wondered if maybe that was enough. Maybe heroes weren't the people who never got scared. Maybe heroes were the people who got scared and did the hard thing anyway. The paramedics were moving the girl toward the ambulance now, her stretcher rolling smoothly over the rough asphalt. As they passed Jake, she turned her head, those brown eyes finding his across the chaos. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't quite hear. One of the paramedics leaned down, listening, then looked at Jake with an expression he couldn't read. Confusion, maybe, or concern. The girl kept talking, her voice too weak to carry, but her eyes never left Jake's face. Then they loaded her into the ambulance. The doors closed, and she was gone, leaving nothing but the wail of sirens and the smell of smoke and the feeling that something important had just happened, though Jake couldn't quite say what. A police officer approached, young and nervous, asking for Jake's statement. He gave it mechanically, describing the accident, the rescue, the explosion, gave his name and address, and watched the officer write it all down in a little notebook. Other witnesses were being interviewed, their phones confiscated for evidence, and Jake caught snippets of their conversations. He just ran right in there. Thought he was crazy. Saved her life, no question. The words felt like they were about someone else, some other Jake Sullivan who was brave and capable instead of broken and afraid. Another paramedic was checking Jake's injuries now, cleaning the cuts on his back, telling him he needed stitches. He barely felt it. The pain was distant, someone else's problem. All he could think about was the girl's eyes, the way they looked at him in that last moment before the ambulance doors closed, not with gratitude, like he'd expected, but with something else, something that looked almost like accusation or maybe sorrow, like he'd done something wrong by saving her, like she'd wanted the alternative. The paramedic finished bandaging him and told him to go to the hospital, get properly checked out. Jake nodded but had no intention of going. He couldn't afford the emergency room bill, couldn't afford to take time off work, couldn't afford anything beyond the bare minimum of existing. He walked back to his truck with Lily, both of them silent now, processing what had just happened. His hands had stopped shaking, he realized. For the first time in 8 years, they were completely steady. He looked at them in wonder, these hands that had saved a life, that had remembered what to do, even when his mind had forgotten how to be brave. They drove home in silence, Lily eventually falling asleep against the window, exhausted by fear and relief. Jake kept replaying the moment over and over in his head. The girl's pulse stopping, his hands moving, the compressions and breaths, the explosion, and the miracle of her gasping back to life. He'd done it. After 8 years of running, of hiding, of hating himself, he'd finally done it, saved someone, made a difference. Maybe, just maybe, started to forgive himself. Their apartment was dark and cold when they got home. Jake carried Lily inside, tucking her into bed, still fully clothed because she was too deeply asleep to wake. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the smell of her, grateful beyond words that she was here, that she was his, that he had a reason to keep fighting. Then he went to the bathroom and really looked at himself in the mirror for the first time in hours. His face was covered in soot and sweat. His shirt was torn and bloody, and his eyes were red from smoke and tears. But beneath all that, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Not quite peace, but maybe the beginning of it. He showered, watching the water run red and then brown and finally clear as it washed away the evidence of the day. The cuts on his back stung, but it was a good pain, the kind that reminded him he was alive, that he'd done something that mattered. He dried off and fell into bed, expecting nightmares, expecting to relive the crash and the fear and the explosion. But instead, he slept dreamlessly for the first time in 8 years, his hands still and quiet on the pillow beside him. 3 days passed in a blur of normalcy. Jake went back to work, standing in the empty mall in the early hours, watching security monitors, and thinking about that Thursday evening. The story had made the news. Local man saves tech billionaire's daughter from burning wreck. They'd shown his picture, an old one from his paramedic days when he'd looked younger and less tired, and the phone had started ringing. News stations wanting interviews, people wanting to tell him he was a hero, his old supervisor from the hospital calling to say they had taken him back any time. He ignored them all. He didn't want fame, didn't want attention. He just wanted to forget, to move on, to let that moment exist as one good thing in a life full of hard things. But on the fourth day, a black Mercedes pulled up outside his apartment building, looking as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine. Jake watched from his window as a man in an expensive suit got out, looking up at the building with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Rich guy, Jake thought, probably lost. But then the man checked a piece of paper in his hand, looked at the address on the building, and headed for the entrance. Jake's stomach dropped. He knew somehow who this was before the knock came on his door. Robert Matthews looked exactly like his pictures in the business magazines. Mid-50s, silver hair perfectly styled, suit that probably cost more than Jake's truck, and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He stood in Jake's doorway, taking in the cramped apartment with its peeling paint and secondhand furniture, and Jake watched him do the math. This is what poverty looks like, those eyes said. This is where heroes live when they're not heroes anymore. Mr. Sullivan, Robert said, extending a hand, I've been looking for you. They sat at Jake's small kitchen table, two men from different worlds trying to find common ground. Robert explained that his daughter Sophie was recovering at Mercy General Hospital. Broken ribs, a concussion, and some internal bruising. But alive. Completely, miraculously alive. The doctors had told him that without immediate CPR, she would have died before the ambulance arrived. Jake had saved her life, no question, no debate. Name your price, Robert said, pulling out a checkbook. Whatever you want. $1 million, $2 million. I can afford it, and you've earned it. Jake stared at the checkbook like it was a snake. All his problems solved with a signature. Lily's surgery paid for, debt erased, a future that didn't involve 70-hour work weeks and slowly drowning in bills. He could say yes, should say yes. Any rational person would say yes. But the words that came out of his mouth were, I don't want your money. Robert blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Everyone wants money, Mr. Sullivan. Don't be proud. You saved my daughter's life. I didn't save her for money, Jake said, his voice harder than he intended. I saved her because 8 years ago, I didn't save someone else. Because I froze up and a 10-year-old boy died while I just stood there. Because I needed to know if I could do it, if my hands could still work, if I was still worth anything at all. Your money can't fix that. Your money can't change the past. The words came out in a rush. 8 years of guilt and shame and self-hatred pouring out in Robert Matthews' expensive face. So, thank you, but no thank you. I'm glad your daughter's alive. That's payment enough. Robert studied him for a long moment, and Jake watched the calculation in his eyes shift to something else. Understanding maybe, or respect. You have a daughter, Robert said. It wasn't a question. He'd obviously done his research, knew about Lily, about the medical bills, about Jake's desperate situation. She needs surgery, $300,000 you don't have. Let me help you, not as payment, but as one father to another, please. Before Jake could answer, there was a soft sound from the doorway. Lily stood there in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her oxygen concentrator humming softly behind her. Daddy, who's that? Robert's eyes went to her, to the thin tube running to her nose, to the way her small chest worked too hard with every breath, and Jake watched something crack in the businessman's armor. This was what real stakes looked like. Not money or stocks or business deals, but a little girl fighting for every breath every day with a smile on her face because she didn't know any better. I'm a friend, Robert said, his voice gentler than Jake had heard it. I'm Robert. What's your name? Lily, she said shyly, moving to stand beside her father. Jake pulled her close, feeling her lean against his leg, so small and fragile and precious. Mr. Matthews was just leaving, Jake said. But Robert stood up, and instead of heading for the door, he pulled out a business card. Think about it, he said, pressing the card into Jake's hand. For her? Not for you. For her. After Robert left, Jake sat on the couch with Lily, holding the business card like it might bite him. The smart play was obvious. Take the money, save his daughter, let his pride go for once in his life. But something felt wrong about it. Transactional and cold. He'd saved Sophie because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted a reward. Taking money for it felt like cheapening the moment, turning his redemption into a business deal. But then Lily coughed, that wet, painful sound, and he thought about 6 months, maybe 8, and what came after. Could he really let pride kill his daughter? The next morning, Jake found himself at Mercy General Hospital without really planning to go there. He told himself he just wanted to check on Sophie, make sure she was recovering. That was his job, wasn't it? He'd saved her life. which made him responsible for making sure it stuck. But as he walked through the gleaming halls, past nurses and doctors who looked at him with recognition and respect, he knew he was lying to himself. He needed to see her, needed to understand what those last words had meant. The ones he couldn't quite hear as the ambulance doors closed. Sophie's room was on the 5th floor, the VIP wing, where everything was nicer and quieter and more expensive. Robert Matthews sat outside the door, looking smaller somehow, less intimidating. "She's been asking about you," he said when he saw Jake, the man who pulled her out. "She won't talk to the press, won't talk to anyone, really, but she keeps asking if you're okay." Something in his voice made Jake pause. Not gratitude, but worry, like Sophie asking about him wasn't a good thing, but a concerning thing. Jake pushed open the door. The room was all white and beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic. Sophie sat up in bed, her head wrapped in bandages, her arms bruised and scratched. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. The same eyes from the wreck, the same darkness in them, the same look that wasn't gratitude, but something else. Something that looked like disappointment. "You came," she said, her voice flat. Not happy, not relieved, just stating a fact. "How are you feeling?" It was a stupid question, but Jake didn't know what else to say. She gestured at herself, at the bandage and bruises. "I'm alive, thanks to you." There was no warmth in the words, no appreciation. Jake moved closer, his instincts as a medic kicking in, assessing her condition, even though it wasn't his job anymore. "The ribs will heal," he said. "The concussion might give you headaches for a while, but you'll be fine. You're young and strong." "I didn't want to be fine." The words dropped into the silence like stones into water. Jake froze. "What?" Sophie looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw tears building in her eyes. "I didn't want to be fine. I didn't want to be saved. That accident hurt, but I thought maybe finally I'd get to go somewhere happier, somewhere where I'm not Robert Matthews' daughter, where I'm not a disappointment, where I don't have to pretend anymore." The room tilted sideways. Jake grabbed the back of a chair, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. The accident wasn't an accident," Sophie said, laughing, a bitter sound that didn't match her young face. "I didn't steer into the median, if that's what you're asking, but I didn't try very hard to avoid it either. And when the car started rolling, when I knew it was bad, I didn't fight it. I just thought, finally it's over." Jake sat down hard, the chair protesting under his weight. He thought about the scene, about how her hands hadn't been on the wheel, about how she hadn't been wearing her seatbelt properly, about all the little details that had seemed like shock, but now seemed like something else. Intention, choice. He'd saved someone who didn't want to be saved, pulled someone back from an escape they'd been seeking. "How old are you?" he asked, though he already knew. 18, just turned 18 2 months ago. "You're a kid," Jake said. "You have your whole life ahead of you. College, career, falling in love, traveling the world, all of it. Why would you want to throw that away?" Sophie's laugh was even more bitter this time. "You think I have my whole life ahead of me? I have Robert Matthews' life ahead of me. The internship at his company that I don't want. The business degree I'm supposed to get even though I want to study art. The society events where I smile and shake hands and pretend I'm not dying inside. That's not a life, Mayor Sullivan. Life. That's a performance." Jake thought about his own life, about working security in an empty mall, about medical bills and a daughter with a countdown clock on her life, about 8 years of running from himself. His life was hard, brutally hard, but it was his. He chose it, even the bad parts, even the painful parts. This girl, with all her money and opportunity, had never been given that choice. She'd been born into a role and expected to play it until she died, and she'd almost chosen death early rather than play it any longer. "I knew a boy once," Jake said slowly. "He was 10 years old, got hit by a car while riding his bike. I was supposed to save him, was trained to save him, but I froze. My hands wouldn't work, my mind wouldn't work, and I just stood there while he died." Sophie was watching him now, really watching. "When I pulled you out of that car, My hands were shaking so badly I didn't think they'd work. But I thought about that boy, about how much he'd wanted to live. His mother told me later that he'd been planning his birthday party, Superman theme. He was going to turn 11 in 2 weeks, and he had plans, so many plans. Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice rough with emotion. You have everything he dreamed of having. Time, health, choices, and you want to throw it away because your father chose the wrong career for you because people expect things from you. He shook his head. I'm not saying your pain isn't real. Depression is real, I get that. But don't you dare tell me you wanted to die when there's a 10-year-old boy who fought like hell to live and didn't get the chance. Silence filled the room, heavy and thick. Then Sophie started crying, not the pretty kind of crying, but the ugly, painful kind that came from somewhere deep. I'm so tired, she sobbed. I'm so tired of pretending, of being perfect, of living for everyone else. I just wanted to stop. Jake didn't know what to do, had no training for this kind of wound. But he thought about Lily, about how he held her when she was scared, and he moved to sit on the edge of Sophie's bed, awkwardly patting her shoulder. Then stop pretending, he said. Talk to your dad, get help, change your major, tell everyone to go to hell if that's what you need to do. But don't give up. Don't waste the life that boy would have killed for. The door opened and a nurse walked in, followed by a little girl dragging an oxygen concentrator. Lily had somehow convinced someone to bring her up, and she stood in the doorway staring at Sophie with wide eyes. Daddy, is she the one you saved? Jake nodded and Lily moved closer, fearless in the way only children can be. She climbed up onto the bed beside Sophie, her small presence somehow filling the whole room. Hi, she said. I'm Lily. My daddy says you were very brave. Sophie stared at this little girl with her oxygen tube and her bright smile, this child who was actively dying but didn't seem to know it or care. I wasn't brave, Sophie said. Your dad was brave. Lily shook her head seriously. Daddy says everyone who survives something hard is brave. He says living is the bravest thing we can do. Out of the mouths of babes, Jake thought. He watched Sophie looking at Lily, saw the way her expression changed from bitter to confused to something else. Something that looked almost like shame. You're sick, Sophie said, noticing the equipment. Lily nodded. My heart's broken, but Daddy is going to fix it. He fixes everything. The faith in her voice made Jake's chest ache. He couldn't fix everything, couldn't afford to fix anything, really, but Lily believed in him anyway, believed he'd find a way like he always found a way. Your daddy's a hero, Sophie said, and this time there was something different in her voice. Not bitterness, but wonder. He says he's not, Lily said, settling against Sophie like they were old friends. But I think he is. He saved you, and he takes care of me. And he works really hard even when he's tired. That's what heroes do. Sophie looked over Lily's head at Jake and their eyes met. In hers, he saw understanding dawning. Here was a man with every reason to give up, working himself to death for a daughter who might die anyway, and he did it with love and without complaint. Here was a man who ran into a burning car despite his terror, despite his trauma, because someone needed him. And here he sat in her hospital room, trying to convince her that life was worth living when his own life was falling apart. I'm sorry, Sophie whispered. Jake shook his head. Don't be sorry, be better. Be alive. For that boy who didn't get the chance. For my daughter who's fighting for every breath. For yourself, Sophie. Be alive for yourself. Lily, oblivious to the heavy conversation, was chattering about her favorite cartoons, and Sophie was listening, really listening, like this little girl was teaching her something fundamental about existence, about finding joy in small things, about living even when living was hard. The door opened again, and Robert Matthews stood there, taking in the scene. His daughter and Jake's daughter, sitting together on the hospital bed, one wrapped in bandages and the other wrapped in oxygen tubes, and something on his face cracked completely. He'd almost lost her, Jake realized, not in the accident, but long before, lost her to expectations and pressure and the weight of being Robert Matthews' daughter. The accident was just the final symptom of a disease that had been growing for years. Sophie, Robert said, his voice breaking, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see. Sophie looked at her father and Jake saw the hunger in her eyes, the desperate need for him to mean it, to really see her for once. I don't want to work at your company, Dad, she said. I want to study art. I want to paint. And I know that disappoints you, but I can't keep living your dream. It's killing me. Robert moved to the bed, gently taking Sophie's hand. Then study art, paint, do whatever makes you happy. I just want you alive, Sophie. I just want my daughter back. He looked at Jake, tears streaming down his face without shame. You gave her back to me, and I'll never have the words to thank you enough. Please let me help your daughter. Let me give you what you gave me. Jake looked at Lily, at her small hand in Sophie's, at the way she was smiling despite everything. He thought about pride and need and the difference between earning something and accepting help. He thought about that 10-year-old boy who'd fought to live and lost. He thought about Sophie, who'd fought to die and lived. And he thought about Lily, who was fighting every single day just to take her next breath. Okay, he said, for her. Not for me, for her. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Robert Matthews didn't just pay for Lily's surgery. He paid for the best surgeon in the country to fly in and perform it, paid for private recovery rooms and specialists and everything a desperate father with no money could never afford. Jake tried to feel guilty about accepting it, tried to feel like he was taking advantage. But every time he saw Lily's face light up at another treatment, another step toward health, he let the guilt go. Sophie came to visit Lily the day before the surgery, bringing art supplies and a tentative smile. She'd started therapy, she told Jake quietly while Lily was distracted by crayons. Real therapy, not just the kind where you talked about your feelings, but the kind where you worked through trauma and learned coping mechanisms and addressed the root causes of pain. It was hard, she said, harder than she'd expected, but it was working. She wanted to live now, really live, not just exist. What changed? Jake asked. And Sophie looked at Lily, this little girl coloring a picture of a heart with wings. Her, Sophie said simply. She has every reason to give up, and she doesn't. She loves life, even though life's been cruel to her. And I realized I've been so focused on what I don't have that I forgot to appreciate what I do. Time, health, a father who loves me, choices. She looked at Jake. You taught me that. Both of you. The surgery was long, 8 hours of Jake pacing in the waiting room while Lily's fate was decided by scalpels and sutures. Sophie sat with him, and Robert brought coffee that neither of them drank. When the surgeon finally came out, still in his scrubs, Jake couldn't breathe. She did beautifully, the surgeon said. The repair was successful. She'll need time to recover, but barring complications, your daughter should live a normal, healthy life. Jake dropped to his knees right there in the waiting room, sobs tearing out of his chest, 8 years of weight, of fear, of desperation, of barely holding on. And suddenly it was okay. His daughter was okay. She was going to live. He felt hands on his shoulders, Robert and Sophie holding him up, holding him together, and he let himself be weak for once, let himself fall apart because someone was there to catch him. 2 weeks later, Lily came home, not to their cramped apartment, but to a new place that Robert had arranged. Nothing fancy, Jake had been firm about that, but clean and safe and in a good school district. The medical bills were paid, the surgery was successful, and Lily was laughing again, running again, being a kid again. Jake went back to work, but not as a security guard. Robert had made calls, pulled strings, and suddenly the hospital wanted him back. Wanted him to rejoin the emergency medical team, to use his skills where they mattered. His first shift back was terrifying. The old fear rose up as he walked into the ER, the old doubt whispering that his hands would fail, that he'd freeze again, that he was a fraud who'd gotten lucky once. But then he looked at his hands, these hands that had saved Sophie, that had given CPR with trembling fingers and somehow, miraculously, brought her back. Shaking hands can still save lives, son. He could almost hear his father's voice, proud and certain. The first patient came in, a car accident victim, and Jake's hands shook as he approached. But they worked. They assessed and treated and saved. And when it was over, when the patient was stable and heading to surgery, Jake stood in the hallway and cried, not from sadness, but from relief. He was back. After 8 years of running, he was finally back. 6 months passed in a strange new rhythm. Lily went to school, made friends, and played without getting winded. Her oxygen concentrator gathered dust in the closet, a reminder of what used to be but wasn't anymore. Jake worked at the hospital and slowly, painfully forgave himself for the boy he couldn't save. He visited the boy's mother, who still lived in the same house, and told her about Sophie and Lily and redemption. She cried and he cried, and she told him what he needed to hear for 8 years. He wouldn't want you to stop saving people. He'd want his death to mean something. Sophie started college, studying art like she'd always dreamed. She came by the apartment every week, bringing paintings for Lily's room and stories about classes that lit up her face in a way money never had. She'd started a volunteer program at the hospital, working with kids in the pediatric ward, helping them process their own fears and pain through art therapy. "You saved me twice," she told Jake once. "Once from the fire and once from myself." Robert Matthews changed too. He stepped back from his company, letting others run it while he focused on being a father. Jake would see him at Lily's school events, at Sophie's art shows, just being present in a way he never had before. Money couldn't buy time, couldn't buy presence, couldn't buy love, but almost losing everything had taught him to appreciate what mattered. On a Thursday evening, 6 months after the accident, Jake drove home from work on Interstate 75, the same route he'd taken that day. Lily sat beside him, chattering about her day at school, healthy and happy and so full of life, it made his heart ache in the best way. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange, and everything felt full circle. Same road, same time of day, same daughter beside him. But everything was different. "Daddy, tell me again how you became a hero," Lily said, like she did almost every week. Jake smiled. "I'm not a hero, baby. I'm just a man who stopped running." She considered this seriously. "But you saved Sophie. That makes you a hero." He shook his head. "Sophie saved herself. I just gave her the chance, or the..." They passed the spot where the accident had happened. Someone had put flowers there, a memorial to what might have been. Jake slowed down, looking at the spot where he'd faced his demons and won, where shaking hands had saved a life, where he'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. "Do you ever think about that boy?" Lily asked quietly. She knew the story now, knew about her father's past and his pain. "Every day," Jake said honestly. "But now when I think about him, I remember that his death meant something. It taught me that I couldn't run forever, that some debts have to be paid forward, not back." His phone rang, the hospital calling, another accident, another life hanging in the balance. Jake looked at Lily. "I have to go, sweetheart. Emergency call." She nodded, understanding now what it meant to have a father who saved lives. "Go, Daddy. That's what heroes do." He pulled over, and Robert's car was already waiting, having agreed to be Jake's backup for situations like this. Robert took Lily, squeezing Jake's shoulder. "Go save someone," he said. Jake grabbed his emergency kit, the same one he'd carried for 8 years without using. But now it was fresh and stocked and ready, like him. He ran toward his truck, toward whatever emergency waited, and his hands were steady, not because the fear was gone. The fear would probably never be completely gone, but because fear didn't matter anymore. What mattered was showing up. What mattered was trying. What mattered was being brave enough to act even when action terrified you. The sky was darkening as he drove toward the accident, but inside his chest something was light. He thought about the boy he couldn't save, the girl he did save, the daughter who was saved by a stranger's generosity, and the man he'd become through all of it. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. He'd never forget that boy, would carry that weight forever, but he'd learned to carry it differently, not as a burden that crushed him, but as a reminder of why his work mattered. He arrived at the scene, another car accident, another person in need. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his kit, but they were also ready. ready to save lives, ready to make a difference, ready to prove that shaking hands could still do the work that mattered most. He ran toward the wreck, toward the smoke and chaos, toward another chance to pay forward what he owed. Behind him, the sun set completely, darkness settling over the highway. But Jake Sullivan ran into it without hesitation. A man who'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep going, keep trying, keep saving lives, even when your hands shake, even when you're scared, even when you've failed before. Because every life mattered, every attempt mattered, and sometimes, just sometimes, shaking hands were exactly what someone needed to pull them back from the edge. He reached the car and got to work, his training taking over, his hands steady despite their trembling. And in that moment, as he saved another life, Jake finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him all those years ago. It wasn't about perfect hands or fearless hearts. It was about showing up, about trying, about being brave enough to act even when every instinct screamed to run away. That was what heroes did, not because they were special or gifted or fearless, but because when someone needed help, they answered every single time, even when their hands shook, especially then. The story of Jake Sullivan, a single father haunted by past failures, teaches us a profound lesson about courage and the power of showing up despite fear. Jake's journey, running into a burning wreck to save Sophie, a stranger who didn't want to be saved, while carrying the weight of his daughter Lily's illness and his own guilt, reveals that true heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about acting in the face of trembling hands and paralyzing doubt. His choice to save Sophie, not for reward but to prove to himself he could still make a difference, reminds us that our past mistakes don't define us. Our willingness to try again does. Jake's story, woven with Lily's unwavering faith and Sophie's struggle to find her own reason to live, shows that every life is worth fighting for, even when it feels impossible. It's a call to embrace our vulnerabilities, to keep going for those we love, and to extend compassion to others, even strangers, because every act of courage ripples outward, transforming lives. Jake's redemption, Lily's survival, and Sophie's newfound purpose illustrate that hope can emerge from the darkest moments if we dare to act. What does this story stir in you? Have you ever faced a moment where fear nearly stopped you, but you pushed through? Share your experiences in the comments. We'd love to hear how you've found courage in tough times. If Jake's story of shaky hands and steadfast heart inspired you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join our community. Let's keep sharing stories that remind us to stay human, to keep trying, and to never stop saving lives, our own or others.